Today, we become legends.
King Arthur is, let's say, controversial in the Smite scene, and for good reason. Quite possibly one of the most overpowered releases of the last few seasons, but most importantly, he remained overpowered for far too long despite being the most nerfed god in Smite history in terms of nerfs per patch since his release. Of course, older gods have been nerfed more, but in terms of nerfs per month or per year since the god's release, Arthur reigns supreme. So in this video, I'm going to take a deep dive all the way back to Arthur's release stats and performance, and the many changes he has undergone to get him into his present day form in Smite. So let's jump right in. So we begin actually slightly before Arthur's release. He is one of the limited number of gods with significant pre-release changes coming out of the playtest phase. Knowing Arthur, and given the title of this video, these must be some pretty heavy hitting nerfs, right? Nope, Arthur actually got some buffs coming out of the PTS phase because people hadn't figured him out properly yet and he was actually underperforming in the playtest phase. Well, it wasn't entirely buffs, he actually got a nerf as well in pre-release. Excalibur's Wrath was changed to have more damage per hit but less damage on the final slam. So I guess you could say this was more of a shift than a direct buff to make the ult more counterable by beads. Before this change, even if you beads the ultimate, you took 15% max health true damage guaranteed regardless of level, which was definitely not needed. But they also increased the scaling on the final hit of Bladestorm in this pre-release patch by 25%. Not a huge deal, but according to Hi-Rez at the time, he was only slightly underperforming on the PTS. Of course, we now know those numbers were heavily misleading and Arthur's release date shows that. Again, however, Arthur continued not to show his true colours upon release as people were yet to properly figure him out. This led to his release patch being similar to pre-release, consisting of one nerf and one buff. These were pretty inconsequential as Hi-Rez were mostly monitoring his performance to see how he was doing before making any major changes. The first big nerf patch to hit Arthur came in patch 6.4, a full 5 patches after his initial release. It was around this time in early to mid-season 6 that Arthur became recognised for what he truly was and rose in the tier list accordingly. A partial reversion to a buff he received previously, along with a slight damage nerf to his 1 and his ultimate actually costing mana. Yes, before this, Arthur could ult you at 0 mana because it only cost energy. One patch later in 6.5, the infamous true damage was removed from Arthur's ultimate. This change might look like a buff on first glance until you realise they made it deal physical damage since the overall damage is increased. But in reality, this was a huge nerf. Just in case you don't know, true damage ignores all protection, so this ult will do the same damage to tanks as it does to squishies. And considering it was max health damage, it was even more of a tank shredder. 660 plus 22% max health in true damage is like 35 to 40% of a tank's HP bar, and this ult basically had no cooldown at launch given how much energy he could generate, which we'll get to more in a second. But even against squishies, this ability ignoring 30 protections or so is basically like Arthur having 30 flat pen for free, so it was a nerf even against squishy targets. But against tanks, this ability was absolutely decimated, deservingly so. Another patch, another nerf. Directly after 6.5, we had 6.6, which nerfed Arthur's energy gain, as I just mentioned, from double energy to only 80% bonus. Not huge, but considering the rate Arthur gained energy at, this was somewhat significant. Believe it or not, Arthur was left alone for a while after this flurry of nerfs, but don't let that fool you. Anyone who played in Season 6 and 7 will tell you that Arthur should have been nerfed more, as he was still extremely dominant. However, larger than any nerf made to the character himself, the biggest change for Arthur came in the Season 7 mid-season patch with the Gladiator Shield rework. For the uninitiated, this item is a large reason why Arthur was so broken for so long. Not the only reason, as we'll see in a bit, but one of the biggest reasons for sure. This item used to cost 1700 gold and finished at tier 2, and it had a passive that healed you for 2.5% max health and mana on ability hits, and that's per target. So hitting 5 people would heal you 12.5% max HP and mana. Arthur obviously has 8 abilities, most with fairly low cooldowns, so his abuse of this item was legendary. Anyone playing back then probably has an experience of an Arthur walking into 4 people at 10% health and coming out with 50% health on a quadra kill. It was a somewhat common occurrence back then. The destruction of Glad Shield was by far the single largest nerf Arthur received in his lifetime and arguably trumps even the removal of Fatalis for Freya, which catapulted her into bottom tier for a long time. I can't overstate how huge this nerf was for Arthur. Even if it's not a direct nerf to the character, this might be the single biggest nerf of all time. Not only was this Arthur's only sustain because he had none in his basic kit, but the mana regen was also huge for him since he's a very spammy character and 2.5% max mana almost refunded the cost of his abilities, especially if you hit multiple people. But moving on, Arthur naturally didn't receive many changes after this because they wanted to see how he settled in without Glad Shield and nerf or buff him accordingly. Turns out, however, that even without his best item, Arthur was still quite dominant going into Season 8, and with his use of the great new items and strategies. This resulted in another nerf to his passive, hitting the mitigations down to 4% from 6% previously, and in the very next patch, some damage nerfs across the board to his 1 in both stances and his ult in both stances. It's also possible that Arthur's 80 energy ultimate is the most nerfed ability of all time when accounting for release date. We already covered the huge true damage nerf it received. The energy nerfs basically count as ultimate nerfs, since they're equivalent to a cooldown increase. They added a mana cost to it as well, which it didn't have before, and this patch hit the damage pretty significantly again. For reference, here is what Excalibur's wrath did at release about 3 years ago. And here's what it does now. Keeping in mind that the true damage is a huge deal, there's a reason only a handful of abilities in the game have it. I'm also not accounting for the energy gain decreases, which is effectively a cooldown increase on the ultimate either. But that's it for all of Arthur's changes up to patch 6.8. It's definitely possible he gets more changes going forward, but up to this point, I think he is genuinely the most nerfed god in history when accounting for release date. Let me know your thoughts on Arthur down below, as I know he's a hotly contested issue in Smite, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.